Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Shakira and I'm going to be teaching you how to sew. So let's get to it. Today I'm going to be teaching you all about seam allowance and why it is important. By the end of this video you should know what is seam allowance, why it is important, and how you can make clothing to your own size by adding in seam allowance. So let's get to it.
So I'm just taking the measuring tape and grabbing the measurements for my mini mannequin. You can do this for yourself, and do ensure that when you take that measurement, that will not be the size of the pattern that you make. For pattern making, you need to add a seam allowance to your patterns. This ranges from anywhere from 3/8 of an inch to an inch of seam allowance. Now I'm going to take a pattern that I've already made that has no seam allowance. This is the actual measurement for the waist of my mini mannequin, and I'm just going to show you how to add seam allowance to the pattern that you've made to your size. So I've chosen to do 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you just add this all the way around your pattern. Why do we do this? We add in seam allowance because it allows you to add in the extra bit that you're going to use that to sew and finish up your edges and hem, and it allows you to do so much. But if you don't add in that seam allowance, I'll show you later on what happens when we don't add in our seam allowance. But yeah, that's basically how you add in seam allowance to your pattern. Seam allowance is also the area that allows you to sew your two pieces of fabric, two pieces or more of fabric. It allows you to sew all of your fabric together. This is important because if you don't add this in, then your garment will have what you've sewn taken out of it. So for example, if your waist is 32 inches and you do your pattern for 32 inches and you just sew that, like the two pieces for that pattern together, then you've taken out about anywhere from 1/4 to 5/8 of an inch out of your pattern. So now your pattern is smaller than the 34 inches that you made their pattern for, if that makes sense. So you need to add in seam allowance so you can account for what you're sewing and piecing together. Design that doesn't include seam allowance, it's straining to fit the body. So if you're having this issue when you're making patterns, it's because you're not adding in the seam allowance that you need for your designs. So please ensure when you're making up patterns and you're cutting out your fabric that you've allowed for that anywhere from 3/8 of an inch to 1 inch. But as I like to say, if you have enough fabric, cut bigger because you can always take it. When you cut a fabric that is small or to your exact size, you can never ever go back to trying to add in the fabric. Once it's cut, it's cut. So this leads me to explain why seam allowance is important. So if you're making your own patterns, this is important to allow for that seam allowance in your patterns. And if you're using commercial patterns, most of these patterns will have your seam allowance included in the pattern. You don't have to add to that, but you can if you would like to. It's just up to you on the commercial patterns, because sometimes you do have to adjust the commercial patterns a little bit to fit you more appropriately or in proportion to your body. So like some patterns, if you're tall, you have to add in a little bit around the waist, and they allow for a line for that to add in and all of that. So now with the other two pieces that I just cut out, they include the seam allowance, and as you can see there at the side, it fits all nicely. There's enough seam allowance to allow me to sew the two pieces of fabric together, and there's enough fabric there for me to later on finish that edge with a zigzag stitch or with my overlocker. Now the last little outfit is a full skirt. It has all the darts in it, and it shows you all of the seam allowance for this skirt design and how it would sit and how it would look finished on this skirt. As you can see, there is seam allowance on this skirt block that I've made for the mannequin. The design lays all flat nice and neatly, and I don't have to pull on that to make it fit. There's enough fabric for me to sew the final seam for this skirt to make it a complete garment, or add in a little mini zipper. But yeah, it just sits rather nicely, and it is the exact measurements for the mannequin, including the seam allowance. So I've just cut out a piece of fabric without seam allowance, and as you can see, the piece, it does not fit around our waist. There's a lot of inaccuracy in that. It doesn't match the measurements that I need. Well, it is a perfect fit, but I needed that extra bit to allow for me to sew up the seam along the side there. I'm just going to show you a few examples of finished seam allowances and hems on a few of my dresses. As you can see, these two skirts have completely different seam allowance lengths, so the seam allowance does really depend on what you're comfortable with. So if you want a bigger seam allowance, then do that if you're comfortable with it, but as you get better Now here I do have a commercial pattern to show you that the seam allowance in this one is included. It specifically says that the allowance is included in this pattern.
Even if you don't need to know what seam allowance is at the moment because you're using commercial pattern, it is really important to understand seam allowance for if you want to make your own patterns in the future, which many sewers do start doing, or if you're using tutorials like on YouTube, you're learning how to make your own patterns like that, you need to know what seam allowance is and where to add it. So thank you for watching. Until next time, bye!